Rome, 274 AD. The Emperor Aurelian holds a single denarius up to the light. It is still silver, in name. In law. In the official proclamations read aloud in every provincial market. But Aurelian knows what his treasurers know, what the merchants in Alexandria and Carthage and Lugdunum have already figured out for themselves: this coin is roughly 2% silver. The rest is bronze, coated in a thin wash of the real thing, just enough to catch the light, just enough to maintain the fiction. A century earlier, under the Emperor Nero, that same coin had been around 90% silver. The empire did not announce the change. It never does. The change announced itself, slowly, in rising grain prices, in soldiers demanding payment in kind rather than coin, in foreign traders who smiled and pocketed the coins and then quietly doubled their asking price. Aurelian would go on to attempt a currency reform that nearly caused a civil war. The machinery of collapse was already running. He was just the man standing closest to it when the noise became impossible to ignore. This is not a story about one emperor or one empire, or one bad decision made in a moment of weakness. This is a story about a mechanism. A sequence. A repeating structure that has operated across centuries and continents with the reliability of a clock that no one wants to read. Empires do not collapse randomly. They do not collapse because the wrong personality was in charge, or because of a drought, or because of a military loss on a distant frontier, at least, not primarily. They collapse because they make the same 3 money mistakes, in the same order, and each mistake makes the next one harder to avoid. By the end of this, you will be able to read the sequence. You will recognize the stages not as history lessons but as a diagnostic. You will see the machinery for what it is. Think of it as a borrowed candle. An empire rises by producing more than it consumes, building real wealth, trade surpluses, productive agriculture, manufactories, a tax base that reflects actual economic activity. The candle is lit from its own flame. But the moment an empire begins to fund its ambitions by borrowing against future production, it has placed the candle inside a paper lantern. The light looks the same for a while. It may even look brighter. But the structure holding it is now flammable. The first mistake is military overextension funded by currency debasement. This is the oldest mistake in the ledger. The logic is always the same: the empire needs to project force, force costs money, money runs short, and rather than tax a politically powerful class or reduce the scope of the military, the government debases the currency. It shaves the coin. It reduces the silver content. In the modern era, it prints. The mechanism is identical, more units of currency chasing the same or fewer goods, but the speed is different. Ancient debasement was slow enough that it could unfold over generations. Modern monetary expansion can accomplish in months what took Rome a century. Spain offers the version of this story that comes with an almost painful irony. In the 16th century, the Spanish Empire controlled the largest silver deposits in the known world, Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, producing perhaps 40% of all the silver mined globally between 1500 and 1800. Spain should have been permanently solvent. Instead, it was bankrupt. Philip II of Spain defaulted on the Spanish crown's debts in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. For sovereign defaults in under 40 years, by the empire that literally owned the mountain of silver. The mechanism was this: the flood of silver did not build industrial capacity or diversify the tax base. It funded wars, in the Netherlands, against the Ottomans, against Protestant England. It funded a court apparatus of staggering expense. And because silver was arriving, the incentive to reform the underlying fiscal structure never materialized. When the silver imports eventually slowed, and when the military commitments did not, the gap between income and expenditure became a chasm. The currency did not collapse in the dramatic sense; it had never really been managed as a currency. Instead, Spain lost its position as the preeminent financial power in Europe to a nation with no silver mines at all, the Dutch Republic, and later England, who understood that credit, not metal, was the real instrument of imperial finance. Spain had the candle. It burned the lantern. Which empire do you think we are most like right now? Tell me below. The second mistake is the erosion of tax base integrity. This sounds bureaucratic. It is, in fact, lethal. The Ottoman Empire at its height, in the 16th century under Suleiman, ran a sophisticated revenue system, the timer, a form of conditional land grant that tied military service to agricultural tax collection. It worked because the state had direct visibility into its own economic base. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, those grants became permanent hereditary holdings, a process called tax farming at its worst. Local power brokers paid the central government a lump sum and then extracted whatever they could from the population, keeping the difference. The Istanbul treasury received less. The population was squeezed more. The state lost accurate information about what it actually produced. By the 19th century, the Ottoman government was so dependent on foreign loans that between 1854 and 1881 it borrowed the equivalent of several times its annual revenue from European creditors, primarily British and French banks. In 1881, it surrendered control of its own tax collection to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a body run by its foreign creditors. It had not been conquered militarily. It had been financially colonized. The tax base had not been lost to war. It had been surrendered gradually, in 1,000 small arrangements that each seemed locally rational. The third mistake is the failure to service debt in sound money, which is another way of saying the decision to devalue the obligations rather than meet them. This is the mistake that breaks the reserve currency. Britain after the First World War is the clearest modern example. Sterling had been the world's reserve currency for roughly a century, backstopped by the gold standard and by the credibility of British institutions. The war cost Britain approximately a third of its national wealth. Rather than accept a diminished role, Britain attempted to return to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity of $4.86 to the pound. John Maynard Keynes called this a mistake in real time, in print. He was correct. The overvalued pound made British exports expensive, suppressed wages, triggered a general strike in 1926, and ultimately forced Britain off gold entirely in 1931. The attempt to maintain the appearance of monetary credibility without the underlying fiscal reality to support it destroyed both. The dollar did not seize the reserve currency role through aggression. It stepped into a vacuum created by Britain's unwillingness to reckon honestly with its own balance sheet. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 merely formalized what markets had understood since 1931. Sterling's global role was finished. The ledger had already recorded the transfer. Here is the false belief that every empire holds at the moment it most needs to abandon it, the belief that its circumstances are structurally different from all prior cases. That its institutions are more sophisticated. That its creditors are more loyal. That its currency is too embedded in global commerce to lose its status. This belief is not stupid. It is, in almost every case, partially accurate. Rome's institutions were more sophisticated than anything that preceded them. Spain's silver was real. The Ottoman state had genuine administrative complexity. Britain's financial system was, for its era, the most advanced on earth. The sophistication is real. The exceptionalism is not. In fact, the sophistication is often what makes the final stage so destructive, because a more complex system can sustain the three mistakes longer, mask them more effectively, and therefore arrive at the terminal point with far more accumulated imbalance to resolve. The more capable the empire, the larger the debt it can build before the reckoning. The clock runs longer. The fall is harder. So here is how you read the sequence when you see it, wherever you see it, in whatever century. Watch the currency first. Not its exchange rate, not its day-to-day fluctuation, but its long-term purchasing power relative to real things. Watch whether military commitments are being funded from current revenue or from the money supply. Watch whether the tax base reflects actual economic output or whether it is being quietly eroded by exemptions, complexity, and extraction. Watch whether sovereign debt is being serviced honestly or rolled forward into instruments that obscure the real cost. None of these are single events. They are gradients. They are stages on a clock that moves slowly and then, when confidence breaks, very fast indeed. The candle burns inside the lantern for a long time. And then it does not. Every great power believed it was different. The ledger disagreed. Subscribe, one collapse decoded at a time.